Okay. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Tuesday. Um, Sorry I waited so long to start, but there's actually nobody in class right now. Believe it or not, there's only online people. So we're just gonna jump right in and start class. So Basil's here. Good morning, Basil. Sean is here. Good morning, Sean. Reza's here. Good morning, Reza. Elizabeth is here. Good morning, Elizabeth. Zartaj is here. Good morning, Zartaj. Rafay is here. Good morning. And Ryan is here. Good morning, Ryan. Okay, so yesterday, there we go. Yesterday, we were, of course, talking about racism. We started talking about this, I think, last Wednesday. And I was trying to drive home that, of course, even though some people find race hard to define and some people want to define it by biological characteristics, in fact, it's not really a biological thing, right? It's a social category that people create based on how people look, right? And of course, how people look is based in biology, but race. Good morning. But race itself is not, right? And so I wanted to make a pretty clear distinction between what race is and what ethnicity is, okay? And I think we've done that. Yeah, so I've just got a few slides here that talk about, again, a lot of the differences that we use to divide or to create races in humans are actually not are not evidence of races, right? They're just kind of genetic differences that have arisen because of environmental adaptability, right? They're not they don't really have anything to do with us really being significantly different, right? So you've seen these slides before. I'm just going to kind of jump through them. But of course, we did say that because human beings believe that race is real and that it's meaningful, that of course it actually becomes real and becomes meaningful, right? And so, again, we can't simply dismiss it as as false or in error, because of course if people believe this to be true, then they start to act as if it is, right? So we were reading that article yesterday that talked a lot about where the category of race came from. We were talking about different types of racism as well, and where we were kind of what this article was describing was the social construction of race in the United States. And so the article says that, or the article kind of outlined the idea that that race was kind of closely attached to colonization, right? And so again, I think I've said before, in terms of colonialism, if one country is going to go into another country and take all their things and kind of enslave the population, then there has to be kind of an explanation for that, right? You have to legitimize why you're able to do that thing. And so race was an ideology that helped people do that, right? It was much easier to sort of take other people's things when you viewed them as less than you, or when you had the idea that yes, these people had resources, but they weren't using them properly. And so because of that, race was a very kind of useful way for colonizers to kind of justify their actions, right? And yeah, in the United States, it was, again, a little bit of an awkward situation here, because if you know anything about the United States, you know that it's the basis of the country is freedom and liberty and the pursuit of happiness and for all, right? But of course that wasn't really true, right? Because the economy of the United States, and particularly in the southern United States, it relied on slave labor, right? There were enslaved people from Africa working on cotton plantations and sugar plantations, and so again, you have this country that you've created where everybody can be free, and then it's like, well, whoops, actually, no, certain people can't be free. And so how do you explain that, right? How do you explain a country with freedom and justice for all, but actually not for all, right? And race helped people do that, right? And again, so once the ideology of race started to kind of take hold, scientists started to explore this idea, right? And so here you can see Thomas Jefferson, who was an American president early on, and who owned lots of slaves himself, turned to science, right? Because he wondered, oh, why, right? Why were these people, why were these people enslaved? And again, there was no scientific explanation for it. It was, that Europeans had enslaved them, right? But again, there was a lot of science that came about at the time in the 1700s. We talked a little bit about Blumenbach here and his attempts to measure human skulls and figure out if you could determine different races from them. And he thought you could. You can't really. There is some kind of broad differences between skulls when you go to different places in the world, but not so much that you can really categorize them into these 5 types, and certainly 5 races of humans don't exist. And so this was kind of a wrong idea, right? But it was one that Blumenbach and others thought they could see these differences in humans, and thought that they had to do with different races. But in fact, they don't. These are not meaningful differences by any means. We said that Blumenbach, probably similar to a lot of other scientists at the time, they had other ideologies kind of clouding their scientific judgment, right? So you can see Blumenbach here was clearly a Christian, and he had some kind of crazy idea about people of color being, having degenerated from white people, and again, this is all bonkers. But again, people believed it, right? And science backed it up at the time. There's a lot of information here, way more than there should be. But again, this craniometry, this sort of classification of humans by skulls, kind of led, it legitimized the idea that race was real, right? And so people started creating these categories, and then science started, kind of working backwards to find out the differences. And so scientists at the time found what they were looking for, and again, it helped to justify the idea that race was a biological reality, right? Which of course it isn't. We talked a little bit about phrenology too. Phrenology is one of these other pseudosciences that people, thought they could, determine the character of people by looking at their kind of head shape and their brain shape. You can't do this. This is all bonkers as well. But people, again, thought you could tell things about people just by looking at them, and indeed, that's not usually the case, right? All right, so I wanted to show you this video here, and so it's just a short box video on race, and it talks a little bit about, again, some of the consequences that came from believing this idea. And it also kind of has some interesting information about changing races. And maybe you remember when we first started talking about race, one of the questions I asked you was, can you change races? And I think most people said no, that's ridiculous, or maybe there's the Michael Jackson example. But well, let me show you the video, and then we'll talk about that a little bit more, okay? So online people, there's the video is in Microsoft Teams, so if you just look on the sort of main channel with all the posts, You'll see there's a YouTube link there. So I'll just let you watch it, and then we'll come back and we'll just sort of review what we've seen, okay? So see you back here in just uh, three or 4 minutes, okay? Right. Okay, so, well, I better put this back on the screen here. Yeah, so you can see some of the stuff we'd already talked about, of course, but some of it was new, right? And so you can see how, when I asked you whether you could change races or not, most of you, I think, rightly said no. But interestingly, it kind of depends who you ask. And so you can see the American government kind of moved people around, right, from one category to another based on whether they wanted these people to immigrate to the United States or whether they didn't want them to, right? And so obviously the Americans' immigration policy at the time was kind of racist as well, right? They were probably taking white people as immigrants much more often than non-white people. And so, yeah, if they needed Mexican immigrants during the war, then suddenly those people, were classified as white, right? And when they didn't want them, they classified them as not white, right? And so weird, right? And so, it's interesting because we often think of race as a skin color, but it's not just that, right? And so obviously, these Mexican immigrants who were being put into one category and then another and then back, obviously their skin tone didn't change, right? They always looked the same. Good morning. They always looked the same, but again, depending on how people wanted to see them, they were put in different groups, right? Yeah, so, I'm just going to go back for a second. There was also that idea, or actually, do I have a slide on it? Let me just look. I wonder where my slides went on that. Okay. There was also the idea that your identity as a black person could change depending on the state you were in, right? And so they mentioned that at one time that if 1/4 of your ancestry was black, then you were considered to be black, and then it was 1/16, and then it was in some places it was 1 drop, right? So if you had any black ancestor anywhere in your family tree, you were thought of as black, right? Which is kind of a little scary, right? That's kind of almost like a racial purity thing, right? I think most people who have one black ancestor way back in their family tree probably don't, probably look fairly white. Interestingly, there was a lot of there were some stories a while ago about white supremacists doing the DNA test, like 23andMe, hoping to find their, proud white roots, and a lot of them found that they had black ancestors in the past that they didn't know about. So, which is kind of, and they look white. What's that? Yeah, it shows that they had, a black great-grandparent or great-great-grandparent that nobody knew about. And so it's kind of funny. I enjoyed that. So this idea of race, again, is has some biological basis, right, in terms of encoding for skin tone and things like that. But it's much more of a social category, right? And you can see that people are kind of moved by the government into one category or another depending on what's convenient, right? Or at least it used to be that way. And of course, nowadays people can, for the most part, they can identify however they want, right? However, well, maybe within limits, however they want. But so in the US, we find that even though there's no biological basis for race, it still kind of starts to gain traction and popularity, right? So here you can see it. The idea of race first shows up in 17th century colonial law. So this is in the 1600s, before the United States even exists, before it's a country. The idea of race is showing up, right? And then by 1790, so this is after the US becomes a country, people are asked to say what their race is on the official census, right? And then there's regulations and restrictions and idea about the government will kind of tell you who you are, right? So for indigenous people, the degree of blood, which is kind of like how many ancestors you have, determines who would be classified as Indian or indigenous. And Canada did the same thing. Canada classified indigenous people by sort of how many indigenous ancestors they had. And so, but again, the boundaries between these kind of racial categories are not very strong in some cases, right? And so, do I have a slide on that, or did I remove it? Oh, yeah. So look at this. So early on in the history of the United States, Irish, Italian, and Jewish immigrants were not seen as white. Just kind of weird. Irish people are like the whitest people you can find, right? They'll sunburn if you turn the lights on, sort of thing, right? So I'm just teasing. Sorry, Irish people. I have some Irish background, so I think I'm allowed to make a little joke. But again, the idea of who's white and who's not, has something to do with skin color, but it also has to do with kind of who's in power, right? And people, to be white is to have kind of full citizenship rights and to be kind of accepted in society. And so people were, not only was the government kind of classifying who was white and who wasn't, but people were actively trying to prove that they were white, right? Because if you could, that means you had better, access to resources, you had more rights, things like that. But again, the idea of what race you are might be a very kind of straightforward question, but it also might be a very complicated one, right? If you're mixed race, or if you were kind of living in one of these times where, the government was constantly redefining who fit into what category. Right? So in the U.S. here, because white people had power, right, social and economic and political power, because they had power, being white wasn't just about the color of your skin. Being white was a position of power, right? It allowed you to have all of the kind of rights and freedoms that one might hope for, right? And so, again, people were actively trying to prove that they were white in order to gain these rights, which again sounds kind of weird, but that's the way it worked. Okay. So here I have a little assignment for you to do. Okay, and what I would like you to do is it's a reasonably simple one, I hope, and it's something that we've done a few times already, but we're going to do it again. So in that article that we read yesterday and on Wednesday, one of the things that article talked about was systemic racism, right? And so systemic racism, we said, was not racism about individual people saying things to each other, but it's about how society works as a whole, right? It's how the entire system works, right? And how some people are benefited and some people are disadvantaged, right? And so again, I used that board game analogy yesterday where I said, it's like playing a board game, except some players have more. Maybe they have more dice, maybe they get more turns, maybe they start off the game with more money. And so just by playing the game sort of creates more of that inequality, right? People who the rules don't favor, they're always going to have a harder time winning the game, right? And people who the rules do favor will have an easier time winning the game, right? And so when the rules are kind of slanted that way, right, when they benefit some players and disadvantage others, when people are playing the game, nobody's really doing anything wrong, right? Nobody has to be, everybody's just trying to kind of live their lives. But again, the rules favor some and disadvantage others, right? And that's kind of what systemic racism or structural racism is, okay? So this article here is talking about America's long overdue awakening to systemic or structural racism, right? So a lot of people denied the fact that this was a case, right? They saw relational racism, like we talked about in the article, where people would say racist things, or they would tell racist jokes, or they would discriminate, and that was kind of that was some people's definition of what racism was, right? And if you don't say any of those things, right, if you don't tell racist jokes or that, then there's no racism anymore, and we're all good. But again, that's not the case because, like I mentioned, the rules are kind of slanted, right? The rules benefit some and disadvantage others. And so racism for the United States is kind of built right into the way the country works, right? Which in some ways is not surprising because it started out, the U.S. started out as a racist country, right? They enslaved Black Africans to work in agriculture, right? And so the country is born on slavery, right? So again, you've got this sort of racism baked right into how the game works, and it takes a long time to correct that. And again, in the US, it's still not corrected. And how old is the US now? 1774 or something? 1874, 1974, 250 years. Country's 250 years old, still struggling with it, right? So these things are tough to reverse, right? So in this article, the author will make an argument, right? So as usual, I would like you to, good morning. As usual, I'd like you to find that argument and tell me what it is, right? The conclusion, what the main point of what the author wants us to understand, and then the premises, right? The ideas that support it or give us a reason to believe that conclusion is true. I've got question 2 here. How does the author identify systemic racism? So the author is gonna talk about how you can see it, right? What is the evidence that we have structural or systemic racism here? So they'll talk about that. And then I would like you to find one piece of data that also supports the existence of systemic racism, okay? Could be in Canada, could be in the US, but one other piece of data, okay? And I'll want you to provide the link where you got it, okay? So if you're on the internet, just copy the link and put it in there, okay? So I'm going to assign this to you, and I've got it in Microsoft Teams, so I'm just going to go back in. So yeah, so I've got it in Microsoft Teams. There's a Word document that you can type your answers into, so it's nice and easy for you. And I'm going to I just want to look here. 4, 7, 8, 9. Okay. So I'm just going to put that in there. I'm going to assign it. There we go. And so the article itself is in Microsoft Teams under Files. At least I think it is. I'm just going to check and make sure. Yes, it is. Okay. So I'd like to give you some time to work on this now. So what I'll do is I'm going to put some time on the clock here. And then I'm going to let you start reading. And then you can, oops, there we go, there. And I'll let you start reading. If you have any questions, of course, you can ask me, but yeah, the question sheet is in Teams so that you can answer it and hand it in for me, okay? All good? Questions? Comments? No? Okay. I'll let you get to work, and then you can let me know. Also, if you have questions about anything that the article refers to, just let me know, okay? Because the article is recent. You can see it's from just about a year ago. But just in case if you're unfamiliar with something, just let me know. Okay, people, you want to take a little break? A little break? Okay. Let's take a break, and we'll come back and see where we are, okay? Right. So we're back then. I'll just give you 15 more minutes. You can finish up. If you're not finished, then it'll be on your own time, but then we'll move on, okay? Okay. So just fix this here. There we go. timer's up there, but I think to quote Kanye West when he interrupted Taylor Swift, I think I'm just going to let you finish. It's not a quote, but I think I'll just let you finish and we'll start tomorrow. Tomorrow we'll talk about Canada's Indigenous people, and it's a bit of a long story, so it's hard to do that in 10 minutes. So I'll let you finish this, and then tomorrow we'll start on that. Okay? Okay, people. So that's about all the time we have for today. So finish up this, hand it in to me, and tomorrow we'll talk about um, Canada's Indigenous people a little bit. I know we talked about that earlier because of events in the news, but we'll kind of talk just a little bit more about that. I have some video to show you. Maybe tomorrow we'll see if we get to it. But until then, I'll let you pack it up, and I'll either see you tomorrow or I'll see you in 20 minutes. Yes. Yes, you do. Okay. All right. See you.